Okay. Well, welcome back to my studio, everybody. And for the seventh class in another summer of drawing, I can't believe how quickly this summer is going by. And I was sitting there last night working out, the schedule for classes to come, and there's so much more information to cram in. I want to let you know in advance that next week we'll be starting to work in charcoal. So we'll do a couple of, at least two classes in a row in charcoal. Um, there's nothing really, sort of extra special you need to do to prep for that. If you have, charcoal pencils, just go ahead and, get a few of them sharpened up and some regular paper or charcoal paper, whatever you'd like to use. If you don't have charcoal pencils and you just sort of want to see what it's all about, you can definitely work with your softer leads of the regular graphite pencils and you'll be just fine. So that'll be starting next week and the week after. We'll also be working a little bit larger because we'll be taking this sort of the idea of blending it and using it in the way that it's most useful for charcoal, which is a little bit different. But today we're going to be doing another class where we're going to be combining using the beveled pencils, the sort of the academic approach, some blending, some erasing, all together. And we're not going to have a lot of time. Those are all techniques that are going to, that each one of them could take a while. So we're going to do this as a sort of a very good start with the idea that you might want to draw this subject matter again. So let me go ahead and share the screen and we can get started. All right. And here we are for another summer of drawing. This is class number 7 on the theme of home. And this time we're going to be doing something called Beneath the Surface. And it's not an underwater scene. What I want to talk about instead is how to deal with a subject matter that has a lot of surface texture or design to it. We have a tendency as humans to want to start drawing that design first and even trying to use it to create the sense of form. Instead, what I want you to do is worry about the overall scene, the lights and the darks, and add any texture and sort of decoration on at the end. So we're going to be going through the steps that you would take to do that. And I'm going to kind of show you where I would be inserting the texture and form as we go. So the concept of home, I'm veering way off track today. I decided, hey, wouldn't it be fun to find something with a lot of stonework that had to do with where I come from, which is Yorkshire in England. And I found a particular castle in Yorkshire that I thought would be good, but I couldn't find a particularly compelling photo. This one here on the left was about as close as I could get because, of course, I wasn't there taking the pictures myself. And that led me to find another another castle entrance. And this was a gatehouse entrance at Lewes Castle, which is also in England, but a long way away from Yorkshire. But this is what we're going to draw today, is this gatehouse entrance, because I really liked that dynamic shadow, and I thought that would give you something to work with. So if we are going to talk about home, we could talk about, our ancestral home, historical home, a gateway into the past, walking paths that have been trodden for over hundreds of years. So as I said, I was pushing it a little bit, but hey, this is my drawing class, and I decided just to take charge and do it. So the first thing I decided to do is to kind of help out the whole process and help come up with a strong design, a strong composition. And that included cropping this a little bit. When I looked at the image as it was over to the left and I saw this scene, I thought it was really wonderful, really beautiful, really balanced piece of photography to work from. But I thought for a drawing, I'd like to have a feeling of being in there a little bit closer, of actually walking through that passageway. And that's achieved by pulling in sort of the idea of where we're going. We can see these people in the distance there. So you can look for scenes that already have strong design, or you can kind of exaggerate them to make them a bit stronger. Testing out your composition, of course, with a no-tan and squinting and looking for interesting patterns and shapes. So when I squinted at this, I mean, I saw this wonderful dark foreground, these interesting patterns of shadow. And even though there were going to be some difficult things in here and a lot of texture, I knew that there was something really strong to work with. So we've talked last week about, the various different aspects of what makes a really good drawing. And the first one, is a good composition, strong design. The second one is convincing form, creating the illusion of dimension. So here we have a number of kind of planes. We have, the first gateway arch, we have this opening, another gateway arch, and then the town beyond, because I believe we're coming out of the castle at this particular point. So although in this class we're relying on a representational approach, and that relies on values, a variety of pencil strokes to create convincing form, it's also fine to do drawings that work in only outlines, or ignore the rules of perspective or break any other rules. One thing we'll be doing before this class is over is we will be actually doing some drawings that rely completely on outline and don't use all this shading and academic technique and beveled, all of this other stuff we've been putting in, because it's useful to know how to do both. So it's not as if this way that we're drawing, where we're concentrating on contrast and value, is by any means the only way to go about drawing. However, the drawing or painting still has to have its own logic to look cohesive, and the cubists are a prime example. So let me just segue to cubists for a second. So here's Georges Braque, and here are three of his, one actual just drawing, and the other two have collaged paper on there as well. But he is not paying attention to perspective. He is not paying attention to representational work at all, although the bowl of fruit is in that general direction, the bowl of fruit with the vase there. But at the same time, regardless, even though he's breaking all those rules and not doing anything representational, not worrying about perspective, you're looking down at an odd angle on that jug and the plate of fruit, it still, these are very balanced drawings. If you squint and look at them, there's a nice balance of light and dark, and the rules within each drawing work. The way he's broken the rules are consistent within each drawing. So I just want to have you keep that in mind. I'm very keen on you understanding perspective and value and how to create form, using shading and textures and your pencils and this, that, and the other. It's also fine to draw all of these subject matters in a completely different style that isn't the one that I'm actually showing you. At the same time, if you do that, you want to try for this feeling of consistency within your drawing. If you're going to break the rules, break them all. Okay, so the last aspect of a drawing, of making a drawing really strong, is telling a story. In other words, just having a drawing that's more interesting than objects or scenes rendered for their own sake. Now, I think it's very difficult when you're starting to draw to understand what this whole business of telling a story actually means. But it doesn't have to have an obvious narrative. Like in this particular case, there's a little bit of a narrative that you could, say from this photo, oh, these people have walked through this gateway and they're going into the town or whatever. You can make up a little story, but it doesn't actually have to be that literal. Really, what you're trying to do is make a scene more interesting to draw and you're trying to pull the viewer, and the viewer could be yourself, into the world that you're creating with pencil and paper and making them stop and have a look around. So this is why I meant, coming in a little bit, zooming in a little closer to this scene actually makes it a more compelling and interesting composition, because the viewer isn't distant from it. They're coming in and having a good look. At the same time, if it was a distant scene, perhaps what you're trying to show is the vastness, what's interesting about the scene at large, rather than the thing up close. So making a scene more interesting to draw, you can come in closer. You can add a figure or two or some other small object that helps a viewer sort of key in on distance. What's in the foreground, what's in the background. You could emphasize or change the weather. You could make a beautiful sunny day into a stormy day, or vice versa. You could change the lighting, make it more lit, darker. And then you can also add something that's called tension. And I'll be talking a bit more about this as we go on through the summer, but tension means having small and large things in the same scene. high things and low things. Having, in other words, not necessarily having all the objects uniform unless you specifically want them to be for a particular reason. So in this particular case, we've got us coming through this gateway, but we also have the tiny little figures in the distance, and that adds a little tension. Now, if you block those people out with your thumb and take them away, it's still an interesting scene, but there's just a little something that's added by having a tiny little person in there. All right. So just to kind of catch us up to where we are now and all the various different things that we've been talking about. Beveled graphite points, you can use varied pencil hardness and consistent firm pressure to get a particular look where the graphite point is laying down washes or large pencil strokes that can give you a particular texture and which will prove to be very useful today. A mechanical pencil or a lead holder is also useful. You can vary the pencil hardness and the pressure, but you can't yet necessarily get a wider stroke than whatever the pencil lead is. However, mechanical pencils are really useful. Standard graphite point that we're all used to, just the conical point. In that case, you can vary the pencil hardness using an H or an HB, 2B or whatever. You can vary the pressure and you can use it for blending. It's good for blending. The academic graphite lead point that we talked about the other week, we can use varied pencil hardnesses and consistent movement or hatching. And this is a different situation than wanting to put more pressure on or less pressure on, although you can do that. But what you're looking for instead is a sense of uniformity. So with beveled graphite points, you're getting a little more texture in your actual lines. Mechanical pencils sort of can even things out or are good for outlining. Same with standard graphite point, which is actually sort of useful for all kinds of sketching and drawing. And then the academic graphite lead point is really for getting in there for the detail and this really kind of smooth finish. And I'm adding in here the charcoal lead point as well, which we'll start using next week. So if you wanted to prep a couple of your charcoal pencils, and this is difficult to do, I'm just warning you, to get a point like you see in this picture here is not at all easy. You'll break a bunch of leads. But if you can get to some type of point and even make it a little bit more pointier by using a bit of sandpaper, that'll get you in the right general direction. Do not worry if you're not able to achieve this. We'll just, as long as you got some kind of point on that charcoal, we'll be fine. And then, of course, using erasers as a tool and using blending stumps as a tool. So all of these things, apart from the charcoal, you can use today, kind of a mix and match. I'm going to lead you through the steps that I would take in this particular drawing, but you can feel free, to do it your own way. So before we got started, I just wanted to show you, I had gone back and last night, just to kind of warm up a little bit, I'd spent about another 45 minutes working on this boot from the other week. And so you can see here with just a little bit more time, and of course, without the rush of trying to get everything ready for a class, I was able to sit there and start to refine some of these areas, work in the stuff under the boot, make some changes and corrections to some of the proportions that I didn't have quite right in my first go. And you end up with, and I think I've got it right here. You end up with a small drawing that has, has a little bit of something to it. So this isn't very big at all, about 5 inches by 5 inches. And likewise, the tool from last week. Similarly, this is about a 5 by 7 image, not very large. And so the one that I've worked up for us for this week, I'll show it to you in more detail in a minute, is likewise about 5 by 6, not very large. At the same time, by pulling in all these different techniques, it takes longer to do, just like this dusty boot one does. So I got as far as I could in the same amount of time I'll be giving you, which isn't very far, but is what I consider a good start for a drawing. So let's just very quickly look at this scene again. Observation. What needs to be in the scene? Okay, we definitely need some arches, a feeling of that archway overhead. The window in the passageway is pretty interesting. If I take them out, it's not quite as cool looking. I like the buildings or the scene in the distance, and I think a person ought to be in there. That's just my personal choice. But what doesn't need to be in the scene, and this is kind of what we're going to concentrate on today, is every last brick and stone. Only show enough to give the general idea, and typically in the areas of highest contrast. So what I used to do when I started drawing, and I would sit down and draw the scene, I would do my little outlines or whatever to get the sense of the place. And then I would get started on drawing bricks because I was pretty fascinated with them. And the whole drawing, it just didn't have the cohesion. Once I started realizing that it was so much more successful to start with values and shapes and add that business of the stones in at the end, things got a lot easier. So where we're getting to today is just to about this position, this point right here. This is about a half an hour's worth of work. There's a lot more to be done if I'm going to take this drawing further, but realistically, this is about how much you'll be able to accomplish. And what I was after was to try to do everything I could to avoid drawing individual bricks. But I started using the beveled pencil and some of the other techniques to get me in the right direction, to take this drawing forward, just as if I would with the Dusty Boots one. So let's go ahead and get started because I've got a number of things to share with you as we work through the various different steps. The goal today is going to be to mix all of these different techniques together, sort of one at a time as we go, ending up with something that you could then take with a little bit of calmness and not me talking in your ear, take to another stage. So let's just go ahead and start with the No 10. Assessing the light and dark patterns, adjusting as you need for interest. Because one of the things that I found really useful when I went back to that Dusty Boot drawing was looking back at the No 10 and trying to, figure out like, where was I trying to go? So what I discovered as I was working on this particular gateway drawing was that in the time given and trying to, do all the various different techniques, it was easy to end up with a lot of midtones. And that my next step, as I would take this further to more detail, would be to make sure I got this really high sense of not so much the contrast, because I mean, there's obviously a lot of contrast here in the No 10 that I don't necessarily need to have in a final drawing. I can be a lot more subtle than that, but I definitely want to have more of that push and pull of light and dark. So let me just give you a couple of minutes to do that. And whoops, dropping my glasses. I'm going to have a quick look at my notes here. So one of the reasons that I keep harping on about this No 10 and getting you to do one of these at the beginning of every class, not only I think is it a good way to start actually looking at, at your subject in general, it gives you an opportunity to play around with some stuff. So one of the things I played around with was this business over on the right-hand side. You can see that I was not sure what to do about, the little bit of greenery that was coming in. Was that useful or not? And, then what did that mean? If I added the dark greenery, does that mean the bricks around it are lighter? Do I need the dark area behind it? And also likewise down on the lower left-hand side, if I just look at this particular image, I can see that very slightly near the bottom, it starts to get a little bit darker than the top. Maybe I need to exaggerate that and have something that sort of, I don't need to have an entire couple of rows of stones like that, stonework like that. Perhaps I can just have that fade off a little bit darker as it gets near the bottom. So the No 10 is a really great place to start messing about with this and figuring out what you want. Now, as I went forward in the drawing, I decided to eliminate the business I had going on in the upper right-hand corner because I felt it was starting to get too busy. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to handle that just in pencil. And one of the things that I definitely found was that when you compare working on white paper to working on toned paper, it takes a lot longer to add in all of those midtones. All of that stuff that we let the paper do in the toned paper class, we actually have to figure out a way to color that in, so to speak, and making decisions on how that's going to go, sometimes simplifying or just eliminating things that aren't really part of the main story. And in this case, to me, the main story is going through that passageway. Just makes life an awful lot easier. Okay, so one more minute at this stage, and then we'll move on. I want to give you enough time to actually work on the drawing part today, because I've got a couple of things I want to throw in there, some new stuff for you. All right. And the first new thing, which you're probably not going to thank me for, is I'm not actually even going to show you the initial outlines on how we got started on this. This is in part due to wanting you to just give this a try yourself. Also, because the actual the picture I took of my pencil drawing turned out to be quite blurry and not very helpful. But all I want you to do at this particular point, and we'll just stay here for a good, 5 or 6 minutes while you work this out, because it's a little bit complicated, is just to use a medium pencil, such as an H or HB, and start to sketch the main lines of the scene. Now, I like to start with the focal point, although it's really difficult for me to do, because what I always want to do is start with whatever's on the left-hand side. And by the time I finish drawing, if I do that, then my drawing is usually extending either too far off to one side, or it isn't all in proportion. So what I have learned over time, as I've mentioned before, is to start with a focal point. And to me, the focal point is this archway, the smaller archway, and then the larger one. So trying to get those two forms in relation to each other, to me, is the most important. The rest of it, not quite so important, but I did want those lines of the shadows to be pretty heavily indicated. I wanted those to be relatively accurate, I should say. And so I didn't draw these lines dark. And in particular, I wanted to be able to not have to fuss with them too much before starting on the drawing. But I found I instantly ran into a problem, because I hadn't been careful enough with what was happening in the archway going on overhead. I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to the planes. So there's one plane of that's sort of parallel to the ground as you come from the opening area. There's an area that's parallel to the ground, then it goes up vertically, and then it goes parallel to the ground over our heads and continues back behind us. And I hadn't really got those arches right. So the first thing that happened when I got to the next stage of having to start to add some tonality in, and I decided to start with the darks. That's what I'm going to have you guys do as well. I immediately had to fix that. I had to stop and make the correction. But it is an awful lot easier to just, when you see something that's not right, if you see something, say something. If you see something that isn't working, stop and fix it, draw it properly. And this first stage, where you're just trying to look at the drawing and see what's going on, it's not easy. And so all of your lines aren't going to be in the right place, and don't worry too much if they're not. As you go on with the drawing, do stop and make those corrections. So here are a couple of things I want to point out while you're drawing, and you're probably starting to see this yourself. This roadway curves past us. So it's almost like we're standing on the sidewalk and the road itself is going to curve off to our right. That means that what is basically the points of the two arches that we see in front of us are not right on top of each other, like a traffic light. The one that's closest to us is a little over to the right. The one that's lighter, it's a little over to the right, because it's following the curve of the road. So these little bits of observation, sometimes you don't notice them right up front. Sometimes it's not till you're in the drawing and you're wondering why it isn't, why is this not quite looking right, that you start to notice. Other things that are probably going to, become more obvious as we're drawing, but I'm just going to mention them now, is the fact that we've got some definite perspective lines that, okay, so our eye level is right about, I'd say at the top of the smallest arch, right before you go through into the town. That's about where our eye level is. So if we look at how the brickwork, how the mortar works, how the smaller stones in the open area, how those lines of stones form, they follow that perspective. Sort of, actually, I think maybe our eye level is a little bit lower than that. Sorry, I'd say we're maybe about at the point in that small arch where the curve starts from the uprights. We're probably about there, and I'm figuring that out based on what I can see of the lines of the perspective in the mortar between the stones that are closest to me. keeping an eye on that perspective, keeping an eye on how that works as there's a slight uphill here, how that works as the scene comes up towards us will definitely help with a sense of realism over time. Just a few more minutes on this particular stage. Now, for those of you who are already drawing in bricks, I know you're out there. I know you're drawing in bricks. Try not to draw any more bricks, really. Try to just get the big lines of the scene in the right place. Try to ignore the fact that there's mortar and all of that sort of stuff. Just look for the large arches. Just look for the lines of the road and the pathway as they go downhill. Maybe even indicate really small how the sides of those buildings work in the distance. Keep that background stuff super light, because if you squint your eyes and you look at the lights and darks, just like you did for the notan, that stuff in the distance is extremely light. And we're going to deal with that with the lightest pencils we have, not with an H or an HB. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up this stage. And now we're going to go on to getting some values in there. So the last time that we talked about working in the beveled pencils, I had you start with the very light pencil, in part because it's easier to control, coming in, working from the lights first, rather than working from the darks first. But when you have a drawing like this, and perhaps when your time is somewhat limited, and you also are probably now a little bit more confident, it's fine to go ahead and start with the darks, just like we do so much on other types of drawing. And in this particular case, I decided it would be useful to use what I think I used was a 6B and a 4B and possibly even a 2B pencil to start working towards the midtones. So we're not just talking about the darkest darks, which would be that little stairway going up the side, all this row of bricks on the left-hand side, or even under the archway. Those are the darkest darks. But we're also wanting to kind of trend towards the middle of the value scale. So, I've said before numerous times about not having to color in an entire drawing, but there are times when you're obviously going to have to use quite a variety of values from light to dark, whether it's your 2H, your H pencils going all the way up to your 4B and your 6B. And in that case, and in particular in a scene like this where we do have a lot of darks, but we need to differentiate amongst them, it's okay to start kind of trending, not just the darkest darks, but the other stuff that's going to start trending towards the middle. At some point, we do have to decide what's going to get left light, what is the lightest stuff. And so we want to keep those areas open still right now. To me, that was the area where the shadow is not falling, and also that middle courtyard where something's going to have to be done with the wall, but I don't know what it is yet. This also harkens back to that whole business of, draw what you see, what's most obvious, just draw that first. When you look at this, you can probably see it. Actually, I need to move on to the one, there you go, where you can see your reference a little bit larger. You probably noticed, though, in that larger view that I was using the beveled pencils a lot and following the direction kind of this perspective, following the direction of the bricks, following the sort of the in and out that I could see going on the left-hand side, with the stonework that is there. What I'm trying to do, it's very hard, because even I want to draw in the individual bits of mortar. I'm trying not to draw the mortar, and I'm also trying not to be too specific at this point about exactly the bricks. Now, this is in part because I didn't want to slow you guys down this morning. I want us to get to a particular point. And if we're actually being very careful about how many bricks and which direction and getting each one to have its own character, which is lovely on a bigger drawing and lovely in a painting and that sort of thing. But this would be really wonderful in watercolor, for example. What it'll do is you'll spend an hour on the bricks on the left-hand side and you won't get the whole scene. So instead, try to use those beveled pencils for the speed. At the same time, while you're using them, rather than just sort of coloring in with big washes, although you can definitely do that, for example, where the shadows are, on the bricks themselves, I tried to vary the direction, have the direction follow the directions I saw the bricks going, and sort of add a little bit of interest in. So unlike the academic drawing where you want that, very consistent, shading and that sort of thing, and you're trying to fill in all those little white areas, I was actually purposefully looking for something a little bit rougher and trying to be a little bit rougher to start to get a feeling of how I was going to do the stonework. So let's just take a couple more minutes at this particular stage. When you're working on a drawing like this, one of the things that starts to happen immediately, and you probably are already into this already, is you're starting to do what's called assessing value relationships. And all that means is that as you're drawing, you're trying to decide while you're drawing, is this area lighter than or darker than the area next to it? And then making the adjustments if you've gone too far one way or the other, or you need to make something darker, or even noting that something's going to have to get darker in a future step, even if you're not messing with that right now. There is a tendency, I think, to get too dark too quickly. I have a tendency to these days to kind of work more into the midtones and save those darkest darks for the end. At the same time, you have to keep control of them. You have to sort of go, well, I do want to make sure that I've got these 3 or 4 dark areas that I'm looking to have at the end, that they maintain their darkness throughout the drawing, even if they're not at the darkest stage, because otherwise it's difficult to assess the other value relationships in comparison with them. And what happens is at every single stage, as you add more pencil in, it will change the things that you did before. And there really isn't any way to sort of, guard against that. Over time, you'll sort of see that situation building up. For example, I already know when I look at the lit area within that gateway that I've got to put some value down in there to represent all that pebbly stuff. But if I probably don't have my archway dark enough right now to accommodate that. In other words, the value that I put in that lit area is probably going to be about the same as what I've got as my archway now. So at some point in the future, I'm going to have to do something about that. But I don't have to mess with it right now. What I am going to do is I'm going to move on to the next step, which shows a little bit of blending, just for those of you. It's really just the same stage, but I did a little bit of blending just so you can see what that looks like. So what I did was while I was still at this same stage, I blended some of my darks, for example, in the foreground and in the midground. And then I restated some of those dark areas with more unblended pencil work. So let's get back to where you can see how that looked. So that doesn't change a lot. I'm going to just flip back to the previous picture so you can see. So I've got unblended stuff here, and now I've got blended stuff. And all it does is kind of smooth things out a little bit. It puts a little bit of tonality behind some of the texture I was putting down. I'm very, very careful at this stage not to go too far with this. One of the reasons why is I don't want to lose all that texture I put down. I just want to kind of move myself a little bit further forward so that I don't have to get in there with a little pencil and neaten up absolutely everything. It helps me unify a little bit more. Now, if I was doing this as a larger drawing, I probably would do a little bit more blending and really have it help me draw those some of the variations in those stones a little bit more. It would just move me along in the right direction. But for this particular amount of time that we have today, a tiny little bit of blending that doesn't mess up your texture is really what you're after. So when we're working on white paper, unlike working on toned paper last week, we really have 3 shades to work with. We think of it as only being our pencils, and the white of the paper. But what we really have is we have the white of the paper as an actual color. We have the dark of the pencils, and then we have this gray. We have all of these grays as well. And when we're thinking about, whether we're leaving an area white or not, sometimes it's good to think, if you are a painter, to think about, well, if I was going to have to come in and put highlights in a particular place, where would those highlights be? And to have the paper kind of reserved for those highlights, for those lighter areas from the start. So whether you tend to look at a drawing and a drawing subject from the darks first, or whether you sort of have this idea about reserving the lights, it doesn't really matter which way you're going about it. The idea, though, is to refrain from putting marks all over the paper, and to have this idea that I can work all these different grays in without having to go past sort of the mid-range of the midtones. I can do an awful lot in the darks with texture as I'm going along, and that blending can sometimes help with that. So once again, we're trying to rely on the pencils. We're trying to rely on our own strokes, our own kind of handwriting. We're trying to rely on the hardness of the pencils and all of these things other than blending. But a little bit of blending is really useful. What we're also going to be doing as we go through these stages today is we're going to be putting more detail on the areas that are most of interest to you. So when I was talking about not getting yourself all wound up in the bricks on the left-hand side, which would be my initial inclination if I wasn't trying to, think of the whole drawing. Instead, it's good to think as you're drawing on this, where am I, you, the artist, where am I, what do I think is the most interesting? So some of you might be going, well, I really think that little passageway going up the side there is actually the most interesting. Others of you might go, well, I like the brickwork going over my head. That is actually the most interesting thing to me. Others of you might go, well, I really like the little window in that archway and that entire thing that's happening down there. And that's where I want the most detail to go. So there isn't just one idea in any scene or image. It's up to you, the individual artist. But what you do want to do is you want to, given that in mind, reserve the detail and the highest contrast and the most interesting stuff that you're going to do for those areas, because you're trying to show yourself and anyone who looks at the drawing, what you think is most important. If you work the whole thing wall to wall, so to speak, it can make a lovely scene, but it can be a little bit less compelling in terms of that idea of telling a story. All right, I'm going to move us on to the next stage now. So at this point, this is the time to start adding in the lighter midtones. If you've started from the darks like we did today, at some point, there's this lighter midtone before you get to white that you need to address. And in this particular case, if we squint and look at this scene, there really isn't an awful lot that really counts as sort of the whitest of the paper. The cobblestones definitely do. Everything on the road definitely does. And maybe a little bit of where the light is coming in from the upper left-hand side within this open space in the courtyard. But there's a lot of value that needs to go down all over the place, unfortunately, apart from that, which is one of the reasons why working on, I'll just do this so you can get your reference larger, why working on white paper has a tendency in a scene like this to take a lot longer than working on tone paper, because we have got to do the work that the tone paper was doing for us before. So one of the things, I'm just going to flip back for a second, notice how kind of sketchy I was in that light area in the middle. This is in part because I know I'm not going to have time to draw in lots and lots of very, very small indications of pebbles and such. What I want to start off with, at least, knowing that I may or may not have time to come back to add some of that more varied texture, is I want to at least have a roughness to that surface indicated. And what I'm also starting to do is go, okay, I need to indicate some of those bricks in the road, some of those areas of stone in the wall, and that far away scene, like how is that going to work? So when you start working in the lighter midtones like this is when things start to get really confusing. To begin with, you start to note things in your drawing that you haven't drawn accurately. And so now you have to very carefully erase those areas. And for me, that archway was one of them. I was like, oh, wait a minute. I don't have enough arches in my archway, how is that going to go? And then just how light am I going to get those buildings in the distance? How is that going to work? What exactly am I going to do with the cobbles that I see up front, the bricks in the pathway up front? How is that going to work? So at this point, you want to start adding in your lights, and I used an H a 2H and I think an HB pencil. I'm not sure. I think definitely an H and a 2H at this point, because I wanted to be really careful. I didn't want to start obscuring what was going on in terms of the overall value relationships, although I could tell already that some of my darks weren't dark enough. I needed to get darker. The only way I'd be able to tell how much darker was to get these other midtones in there. So when I was working on this, and I'm now putting more, values all the way around. I'm kind of coloring, I should, you might want to say, or adding shading in various different places. I'm actually trying to put in a lot of texture because once again, I want to get the feeling at the end of this that there's some brickwork without actually having had to draw bricks themselves. This is not an easy thing to do. And what will happen is you'll do a drawing like this. And this is very much like that whole thing when we were auditioning a scene with the Robin a few weeks ago, where you're trying things out. And you're trying out which pencils actually are the ones that I'm going to need in order to carry this off. Now, after a while, say you draw a bunch of stone walls in chill marker, say you draw a bunch of things that are made out of brick or whatever, you'll start to decide, if I use my H, my 2B, and my 6B or whatever it is, I can get a particular look without having to use the entire range of pencils. But I think when you're just starting off to begin with, it's difficult to make that assessment. And in particular, if you're working on paper like I am, this Artistico Fabriano, that has a lot of texture already, it because you want to sort of work with the texture, not fight against it. But it can be difficult because at this particular point, you don't have a lot of graphite down in the darks to make them really dark. You haven't filled in all those spaces that might be open. And now you've got the lights coming in on top of that. And there's a limit to how light a light can be without actually going to the white paper. It can get really confusing. So let's just move on to the next stage. So at this particular point, this is sort of where I ended up with the drawing, but I'm going to show it to you for the next two stages, just so that you can kind of see how far I got, how far I didn't get. At this particular point, I decided, okay, it was time to come back in, use the academic drawing technique of the finer point, and start adding more detail and clarity to both the foreground and also the midground, varying the pencil pressure, the lead hardness, and squinting to assess the relative values. So you can see it a little bit better when it's small like this. So just take a few moments to start kind of adding in your darks and kind of figuring out where you're going. Now, what I ended up doing, and which I would need to definitely, enhance if I were going to take this drawing far further, I got pretty interested in that little stairway going upstairs, over there to the right. And I actually made it a little on the dark side. I actually kind of, now I've got two areas of interest. I've got my little guy walking further out, and I have the stairway as well. So at some point, I'm going to have to make a decision about this. I'm either going to have to lighten the area in the stairway if I want the interest to be on the little figure I put in the outside, or another alternative is to darken up what's going on in my archway. So what I did at this stage, when I started adding in this more, academic drawing technique of the smaller, the circles, kind of filling things in, I was looking to pull out a little bit more interest in the shadows than I had before. And I was also trying to, what would be a good word to use? Modulate, I guess, the feeling of the bricks overhead. So I hadn't got quite as far as deciding, I need to make that, arch overhead darker, which would definitely be the next step to go to. I was starting off by just trying to go, okay, I need to get some perspective lines worked in with the actual stonework that's going on. And I also need to start bumping up the feeling of the midtones being smoother. Now, to work on a drawing like this and take it further would take another, probably hour or so to mess around with, to make any corrections that needed to be made, to add in, the detail. But what's important is that I am still not drawing in individual bricks, but I'm starting to get a more brick-like feel. Now, what I did do, and I'm just going to move on to looking at this a little bit closer, for step number 5, time to pull it all together. Check your NO10. Is your design still strong? Do you need to take away or add in details and add in a person if you haven't yet? watch that perspective. Now I'm going to go back to where you can see the large picture so you can keep going with that. So as you develop your drawing, as you move from stage to stage, it becomes more and more important to look back at that notan, look at that, the design, strong design that captured you initially, and work your drawing back towards that. So where I am here is about, a 75% point, I think, in terms of working back towards the darks. And I have to keep assessing, is there anything that needs to be taken in or taken out? I got my little arches back in. That was a good start. What else would I like to do now? How would I like to add in some of those little stonework in the background? And I'll tell you right now that if I'm going to add stonework in, the last thing I want to do is be drawing little round circles in the background over the arch. What I would do, but I would do it judiciously near the very end, would be to come in with a beveled pencil, a lighter beveled pencil, and make just a few marks, only a few marks to represent some of those stones. So I got started on that a little bit closer to us. I started marking some of the areas between the mortar, both in the lower left-hand side and over on the right in the archway. At each point, I'm thinking to myself, do I need more than this? Is it understood that this is stonework or not? And this is kind of an individual decision to make about how far you're actually going to go with that. Are you going to actually draw, most of that stonework in, like the darks of the lines, or not? So when you get to the point of having to draw things that are complicated, so let's talk, for example, about the pattern on fabric. That's a really good one. You're drawing a picture of a person in a dress. They have flowers on them. Another scene might be, inside an Islamic, or the outside of an Islamic temple with all of those tiles, a brickwork scene like this, or just a brickwork on a house, perhaps something with a lot of woodwork. How do you determine exactly where the detail should be? So I'm using this particular scene as an example of that. And what I suggest doing is starting, like we did today, starting with the values, working your way into the feeling of a scene that works, the lights and the darks, the shading, the shadows. And from that actual form that is working, with the lights and darks and all the rest of that, then you start adding on just enough detail to give a suggestion of what's going on. And what I like to do is I like to have some of that detail as as whatever it is, the fabric or the stone or whatever, is coming out of the shadows. So a little bit in the highlight, you can see that I kind of had to, because the light was capturing that cobblestone really clearly. It made sense to have a few little marks indicated. But what I'm really doing is I am making sure that where I am showing that texture is in the darks. It's helping me create interest in the darks. But as I'm going to move out forward into the scene, I'm going to have a lot less texture. I don't really want people's eyes to stop in this lit middle section. I actually want them to go further into the archways and then beyond it, look at the little person. So the decision making that has to happen as you go, what will happen is you will make marks. They may or may not be right. You have to make some more. You have to do a little bit more shading, or add a little bit more something else, and then kind of make an assessment how that works. Once you've drawn a number of subjects like this, it'll be a lot easier. You can say to yourself, oh, I know that if I just keep the detail really basic in the darkest areas and have a few lines as I come out of the darkest areas, that'll be enough to indicate whatever's going on. This kind of scene definitely holds true, and this sort of thought holds true. For example, say you're going under any kind of tunnel or a covered bridge, or underneath a bridge in general, or trestles, or in the dark part of an alley, where you want to show the darks and the lights. You want to show texture, and a perfect place to indicate that is right as you're coming out of the darks into the light, not necessarily filling up the entire light section with bricks and things like that. So on clothing, the same thing happens. Your clothing, the form undulates, making folds and forms. Where you want the detail of what that fabric looks like is on the part that is out closest to the viewer, the sort of the ups, not necessarily the downs. So in the shadows of the fabric, you can fade the design away. You can have it be just part of the form of the fabric. And a technique I use for both painting and drawing, if I've got something that is detailed and I do want to show a specific fabric, is I might just put a few lines in at the very beginning to show, what that pattern looks like, or in this case, what the perspective lines for the bricks are. Keep those in mind as I'm drawing, but be really careful not to actually add that detail until the very, very end, so the last stage. All right, so now I'm going to do something that you're probably, not going to like so much, but I'm going to just move on from this particular picture to the next picture and lose the reference. And I want you to just continue drawing for a few more minutes. Oops. Okay, so this is just, getting to the final stage, just sort of looking at it from the No-10 and kind of how it develops over the course of a half an hour or so. The reason I want you to just draw for a few more minutes without being able to see the reference material is because I want you to get in this sort of habit of being able to, look at something closely, have an idea of where you're going, start to draw, get some stuff in there, and then be able to, if that scene suddenly changed, or if you weren't there, if you had to go home at this particular point and you couldn't, sit there any longer, whatever it might happen to be, sudden downpour, the idea of what you're trying to draw is now more important than having the reference in front of you. It's a little bit unnerving, I think, to begin with, because, you were probably looking at some very specific brick or stone or something when I decided to do this to you. But I think what's most important is that rather than worrying about the details, you're worrying about your overall scene and the cohesion of the overall scene. So when I sit here and I look at, these stages, I can see where I'm going to go next. I don't actually need the reference anymore. I can look back at the No-10. I can go, I can see where darker bricks need to be. I can see where I can add a little bit of detail, and I can make stuff up out of my head. Because I guarantee no one is going to take your sketchbook and stand here at Lewis Castle and go, wow, Amy didn't get her bricks right. It's not going to happen at all. What they're going to do instead is go, wow, that's a really lovely scene of this archway. And that's really interesting the way, you have a little person, I wonder where they're going to, through the other side of the gateway. Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap this up now that I've got the unnerving part of that over. Hey everyone, I've come back after the class is over and I did some more work on this artwork. You can see it here at a small size. I worked on it for about another hour, and I'll show it to you large in the next slide just to see where I got to. Still trying to keep the feeling of the No-10 in there. Thanks so much. Okay, back to your regularly scheduled program. And I just want to talk about, as we usually do, just sort of wrapping up the entire idea of what we were doing today. So, like I said, we'll be moving next week onto charcoal, but I really want you to continue as you draw to keep your whole bevy of pencils around you and to be able to pull in any technique and idea that you want to, whether you're using a mechanical pencil, regular pencils, beveled ones, trying a little of that academic approach. I have you going from step to step through these things. But when I draw myself, and when I was drawing on the dusty boots, I'm just drawing. I'm just pulling in all of these tools whenever I feel like, whenever I think they're going to be useful. But I'm trying to use them all because I know that that'll add a bit more interest to what's going on. So, we've got this concept of home, this theme of home that we've been following through the summer. Today, I kind of abandoned it, or I sort of went off piste, as they say in skiing. But sometimes one good idea will lead to another, and let your ideas travel where they will. You may end up in a different place than you started off. Now, of course, if I was trying to do a theme for a competition, I'd have to figure out how to pull myself right back onto the ski slope. But in this particular case, sometimes one idea, one image will lead you to a better one, or a better idea, or a better scene. It can be difficult sometimes if you're out plein air drawing or painting, because you keep looking for another better scene, you can spend your whole time walking around rather than just sitting down and drawing. So, there's a downside to that as well. But I think what's more important is not to let not for us, the artists, to be the one that stops the flow of ideas. We just need to let them keep going. However, don't waste time drawing something that's going to be problematic. If you're already having trouble, if you look out at the scene outside and you see all these trees and you don't know where to get start, and the sweat is starting to form on your brow, and you're not quite sure how to make a good scene out of it, don't do that scene. Draw something else. Draw something that does look interesting, and maybe it's maybe it's a microcosm, maybe it's the roots of the trees rather than a whole forest. Maybe it's something much smaller that is of interest and still represents the whole. So you can edit and change, of course, any scene, but if you're fighting it from the start, if you're fighting the image from the start, there's no point. So when I looked at these two images I was trying to decide for class today, I went with the one that was easier, the one where I could see the design more clearly, where I knew that would be fun to draw. There's no sin in doing that. It's whatever you feel like drawing. Keep your eye, keep the story in mind, whatever it is you're trying to concentrate on. Is it about the design, the vastness of the scene, details, beauty, the decay, the narrative? For me, it really was about the design. I really loved the shadows and the darks and lights of those arches. You might see something different in there, and your idea for the drawing may be different. But whatever it is, kind of keep it in mind as you draw. The no-tan is your way in to a strong design and a good composition. If I left my drawing where it stands right now and didn't take it further, didn't spend another half hour on it or whatever to, tighten it up and get that dark and light sense back, it would be an okay drawing, but it wouldn't have achieved what I started off to do. So what happens to me is I'm a busy person like you guys are. You're probably leaving your drawings around, don't have time to go back to them. But if you find later in the week you have a half hour here or there and a little time to spend, try to take your drawing to the next level, because that's what I'm going to try to do, just like I did with the dusty boots. So technique, when there's a lot of surface design or texture, it's useful to squint to remove that confusion from our minds and just see the lights and darks. Get in some of those darks and darker midtones first. The reason I say that is, although we started before doing the lights first, just to kind of get you comfortable, it's easy to start coloring everything in if you start with the lights. If you start with the darks, all of a sudden you can see that contrast and you don't have to put as much other mid-tone stuff in. Use blending sparingly, not as a substitute for pencil control, although it's a lot of fun to do stuff with blending. Vary those pencil strokes. Try to not, as I say, put marks all over the page, not color everything in. When you get to the end, you can come back and refine both the lights and the darks, adding just enough texture to suggest the surface. So when I work on this later this week, if I come back and do a little bit more drawing, I'm going to try to be really judicious about how I deal with the gateway. And it'll be a challenge to get both the darkness of that shaded area in, a feeling of the stone, but not starting to draw individual little outline stones. That's what I'm going to be trying to avoid. So put details in contrast where you want the attention to be given. Our eyes are drawn to that detail and contrast. That's why it was a problem when I put too much dark in that little hallway going up the side. All of a sudden now there's a competition. What am I supposed to be looking at? I either have to add more darks overall or modulate one of the dark areas. Areas closest to you can use detail because that'll help give a sense of depth to your drawing. Whereas like the distant town, I don't want to be drawing those little tiny windows because it'll pull my eye in too many different directions. And then in the darker midtones, detail and contrast in the darker midtones can make the shadow areas more interesting and can suggest what the more lit areas are going to look like. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now. All right. I know that we're covering a lot of information and that trying to do these drawings and get the drawings done in the amount of time that we have is really problematic. But I hope you're starting to see the way into a drawing and how to get yourself started of course, I'm hoping that over time you'll have, an hour or two maybe to spend on a particular drawing and to be able to work on it in that particular way. But even if you have just a short amount of time and can get some of these techniques to be just something that you do automatically, that you reach for those beveled ended pencils, you reach for the ones for the academic point when you need those details, and do a little judicious blending as it needs to happen. No, I think we're set up really well now for moving into charcoal next week. We're going to have a figure, a person in the scene, and a lot of contrast. So be prepared to get a little messy next week because we're going to be spreading some charcoal around. All right, everybody, thank you so much. Really wonderful to have you back in the studio for another summer of drawing, and I can't wait to see you again next week.
Okay.